Actually, there we go. Put your shirt on.
Daddy, your mic.
What about it?
It's blocking me.
Hello!
And welcome to Larry's Library.
Please excuse the child behind me. He got out of the pool and hadn't got his shirt on yet. So he's hiding behind me to get his shirt on.
Now I'm eating cake.
And Tara's eating cake. So we're continuing to read Pinocchio. Poor Pinocchio. Well, actually, he's had a blast for the past 5 months living in the land of boobies. It's not what you think. It's not what you think. So we would begin with chapter 32. Pinocchio becomes a real little donkey and begins to bray. What was this surprise? I will tell you, my dear little readers. The surprise was that Pinocchio, when he awoke, scratched his head, and in scratching his head he discovered... Can you guess in the least what he discovered? He discovered, to his great astonishment, that his ears had grown more than a hand. You know that the puppet, from his birth, had always had very small ears, so small that they were not visible to the naked eye. You can imagine, then, what he felt when he found that during the night his ears had become so long that they seemed like 2 brooms. He went at once in search of a glass that he might look at himself, but not being able to find one, he filled the basin of his washing stand with water, and he saw reflected what he certainly would never have wished to see. He saw his head embellished with a magnificent pair of donkey's ears. Only think of poor Pinocchio's sorrow, shame, and despair. He began to cry and roar, and he beat his head against the wall. But the more he cried, the longer his ears grew. They grew, and became hairy towards the points. At the sound of his loud outcries, a beautiful little marmot that lived on the first floor came into the room. Seeing the puppet in such grief, she asked earnestly, "What has happened to you, my dear fellow lodger?" "I am ill, my dear little marmot, very ill, and of an illness that frightens me. Do you understand counting a pulse?" "A little." "Then feel and see if by chance I have got fever." The little marmot raised her right forepaw, and after having felt Pinocchio's pulse, she said to him, sighing, "My friend, I am grieved to oblige to give you bad news." "Oh, what is it?" "You have got a very bad fever." "What fever is it?" "It is donkey fever." "That is a fever that I do not understand," said the puppet, but he understood it only too well. "Then I will explain it to you," said the marmot. "You must know that in 2 or 3 hours you will be no longer a puppet or a boy." "Then what shall I be?" "In 2 or 3 hours you will become really and truly a little donkey, like those that draw carts and carry cabbages and salad to market." "Oh, unfortunate that I am! Unfortunate that I am!" cried Pinocchio, seizing his 2 ears with his hands and pulling them and tearing them furiously as if they had been someone else's ears. "My dear boy," said the marmot, by way of consoling him, "what can you do to prevent it? It is destiny. It is written in the decrees of wisdom that all boys who are lazy and who take dislike to books, to schools, and to masters, and who pass their time in amusement, games, and diversions and terraria," oh, that one's not on there, "must end sooner or later by becoming transformed into so many little donkeys." "But is it really so?" asked the puppet, sobbing. "It is indeed only too true, and tears are now useless. You should have thought of it sooner." "But it was not my fault, believe me, little marmot. The fault was all Candlewick's." "And who is this Candlewick?" "One of my schoolfellows. I wanted to return home. I wanted to be obedient. I wished to study and to earn a good character. But Candlewick said to me, 'Why should you bother yourself by studying? Why should you go to school? Come with us instead to the land of boobies. There we shall none of us have to learn. There we shall amuse ourselves from morning to night, and we shall always be merry.'" "And why did you follow the advice of that false friend, of that bad companion?" "Why, Because, my dear little marmot, I am a puppet with no sense, and with no heart. Ah, if I had had the least heart, I should never have left that good fairy who loved me like a mamma, and who had done so much for me. And I should be no longer a puppet, for I should by this time have become a little boy like so many others. But if I meet Candlewick, woe to him, he shall hear what I think of him. And he turned to go out. But when he reached the door, he remembered his donkey's ears, and feeling ashamed to show them in public, what do you think he did? He took a big cotton cap, and putting it on his head, he pulled it well down over the point of his nose. He then set out and went everywhere in search of Candlewick. He looked for him in the streets, in the squares, in the little theaters, in every possible place, but he could not find him. He inquired for him of everybody he met, but no one had seen him. He then went to see him and to seek him at his house, and having reached the door, he knocked. "Who is there?" asked Candlewick from within. "It is I," answered the puppet. "Wait a moment, and I will let you in." After half an hour, the door was opened, and imagine Pinocchio's feelings when, upon going into the room, he saw his friend Candlewick with a big cotton cap on his head which came down over his nose. At the sight of the cap, Pinocchio felt almost consoled, and thought to himself, "Has my friend got the same illness that I have? Is he also suffering from donkey fever?" And pretending to observe nothing, he asked him, smiling, "How are you, my dear Candlewick?" Very well as a mouse in Parmesan cheese." "Are you saying that seriously?" "Why should I tell you a lie?" "Excuse me, but why then do you keep that cotton cap on your head which covers up your ears?" The doctor ordered me to wear it because I have hurt this knee. And you, dear puppet, why have you got on that cotton cap pulled down over your nose?" The doctor prescribed it because I have grazed my foot." "Oh, poor Pinocchio!
Ooh, poor Candlewick!"
After these words, a long silence followed, during which the two friends did nothing but look mockingly at each other. At last, the puppet said in a soft, mellifluous voice to his companion, "Satisfy my curiosity, my dear Candlewick. Have you ever suffered from disease of the ears?" "From disease of the ears?" "Never. And you?" "Never. Only since this morning one of my ears aches." "Mine is also paining me." "You also? And which of your ears hurts you?" "Both of them. And you?" "Both of them. Can we have got the same illness?" "I fear so." "Will you do me a kindness, Candlewick?" "Willingly, with all my heart." "Will you let me see your ears?" "Why not? But first, my dear Pinocchio, I should like to see yours." "No, you must be the first." "No, dear, first you, and then I." "Well," said the puppet, "let us come to an agreement like good friends." "Let us hear it." "We will both take off our caps at the same moment. Do you agree?" "I agree." "Then attention!" And Pinocchio began to count in a loud voice. 1, 2, 3. At the word 3, the two boys took off their caps and threw them into the air. And then a scene followed that would seem incredible if it was not true. That is, that when Pinocchio and Candlewick discovered that they were both struck with the same misfortune, instead of feeling full of mortification and grief, they began to prick their ungainly ears and to make 1,000 antics, and they ended by going into bursts of laughter. And they laughed and laughed and laughed until they had to hold themselves together. But in the midst of their merriment, Candlewick suddenly stopped, staggered, and changing color, said to his friend, "Help, help, Pinocchio! What is the matter with you?" "Alas, I cannot longer stand upright." "No more can I!" exclaimed Pinocchio, tottering and beginning to cry. And whilst they were talking, they both doubled up and began to run around the room on their hands and feet. And as they ran, their hands became hooves, their faces lengthened into muzzles, and their backs became covered with a light gray hairy coat sprinkled with black. But do you know what was the worst moment for these two wretched boys? The worst and the most humiliating moment was when their tails grew. Vanquished by shame and sorrow, they wept and lamented their fate. Oh, if they had been but wiser! But instead of sighs and lamentations, they could only bray like asses, and they brayed loudly and said in chorus, "Ah, ah, 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 ah." Whilst this was going on, someone knocked at the door, and a voice on the outside said, "Open the door, I am the little man. I am the coachman who brought you to this country. Open at once, or it will be the worse for you." And that's the end of that chapter. So chapter 32. Pinocchio is taken to be sold and is bought by the director of a company of buffoons, but one evening he lames himself, and then he is bought by a man who purposes to make a drum of his skin. So now that you know the full, let's get to the story. That's a long chapter name, isn't it? Finding that the door remained shut, the little man burst it open with a violent kick, and coming into the room, he said to Pinocchio and Candlewick with his usual little laugh, "Well done, boys. You brayed well, and I recognized you by your voices. That is why I am here." At these words, the two little donkeys were quite stupefied, and stood with their heads down, their ears lowered, and their tails between their legs. At first the little man stroked and caressed them. Then, taking out a currycomb, he currycombed them well. And when by this process he had polished them till they shone like two mirrors, he put a halter round their necks, and led them to the marketplace in hopes of selling them and making a good profit. And indeed buyers were not wanting. Candlewick was bought by a peasant whose donkey had died the previous day. Pinocchio was sold to the director of a company of buffoons and tightrope dancers, who bought him that he might teach him to leap and to dance with the other animals belonging to the company. And now, my little listeners, you will have understood the fine trade that that little man's pursued. The wicked little monster, who had a face all milk and honey, made frequent journeys round the world with his coach. As he went along, he collected, with promises and flattery, all the idle boys who had taken an aversion to books and school. As soon as his coach was full, he conducted them to the land of boobies, that they might pass their time in games, in uproar, and in amusement, and playing terraria. No, I'm sorry, that last one's not here. When these poor deluded boys, from continual play and no study, had become so many little donkeys, he took possession of them with great delight and satisfaction, and carried them off to the fairs and markets to be sold. And in this way he had in a few years made heaps of money, and had become a millionaire. What became of Candlewick I do not know, but I do know that Pinocchio, from the very first day, had to endure a very hard, laborious life. When he was put into his stall, his master filled the manger with straw, but Pinocchio, having tried a mouthful, spat it out again. Then his master, grumbling, filled the manger with hay, but neither did the hay please him. "Ah!" exclaimed his master in a passion, "does not hay please you either? Leave it to me, my fine donkey. If you are so full of caprices, I will find a way to cure you." And by way of correcting him, he struck his legs with his whip. Pinocchio began to cry and to bray with pain, and he said, braying, I cannot, it's just straw." "Then eat hay," said his master, who understood perfectly the asinine dialect. It gives me a pain in my stomach." "Do you mean to pretend that a little donkey like you must be kept on breasts of chickens and capons and jelly?" asked his master, getting more and more angry, and whipping him again. At this second whipping, Pinocchio prudently held his tongue and said nothing more. The stable was then shut, and Pinocchio was left alone. He had not eaten for many hours, and he began to yawn from hunger. And when he yawned, he opened a mouth that seemed as wide as an oven. At last, finding nothing else in the manger, he resigned himself and chewed a little hay, and after he had chewed it well, he shut his eyes and swallowed it. This hay is not bad," he said to himself, "but how much better it would have been if I had gone on with my studies. Instead of hay, I might now be eating a hunch of new bread and a fine slice of sausage. But I must have patience. The next morning, when he woke up, he looked in the manger for a little more hay, but he found none, for he had eaten it all during the night. Then he took a mouthful of chopped straw, but whilst he was chewing it, he had to acknowledge that the taste of chopped straw did not in the least resemble a savory dish of macaroni or rice.
But I must have patience,
he repeated as he went on chewing.
May my example serve at least as a warning to all disobedient boys who do not want to study. Patience, patience, patience.
Patience indeed, shouted his master, coming at that moment into the stable. Do you think, my little donkey, that I bought you only to give you food and drink? I bought you to make you work, and that you might earn money for me. Up then, at once. You must come with me into the circus, and there I will teach you to jump through hoops, to go through frames of paper head foremost, to dance waltzes and polkas, and to stand upright on your hind legs. Yes? Huh. Poor Pinocchio, either by love or by force, had to learn all these fine things, but it took him 3 months before he had learnt them, and he got many a whipping that nearly took off his skin. At last the day came when his master was able to announce that he would give a really extraordinary representation. The many-colored placards stuck on the street corners were thus worded: Great full-dress representation tonight. Will take place the usual feats and surprising performances executed by all the artists and by all the horses of the company, and moreover the famous little donkey Pinocchio, called the star of the dance, will make his first appearance. The theater will be brilliantly illuminated. On that evening, as you may imagine, an hour before the play was to begin, the theater was crammed. There was not a place to be had, either in the pit or the stalls or in the boxes even, by paying its weight in gold. The benches round the circus were crowded with children and with boys of all ages, who were in a fever of impatience to see the famous little donkey Pinocchio dance. When the first part of the performance was over, the director of the company, dressed in a black coat, white shorts, and big leather boots that came above his knees, presented himself to the public, and after making a profound bow, he began with much solemnity the following ridiculous speech. Respectable public, ladies and gentlemen, the humble undersigned, being a passer-by in this illustrious city, I have wished to procure myself the honor, not to say the pleasure, of presenting to this intelligent and distinguished audience a celebrated little donkey, who has already had the honor of dancing in the presence of His Majesty the Emperor of all the principal courts of Europe. And thanking you, I beg of you to help us with your inspiring presence and to be indulgent to us. This speech was received with much laughter and applause, but the applause redoubled and became tumultuous when the little donkey Pinocchio made his appearance in the middle of the circus. He was decked out for the occasion. He had a new bridle of polished leather with brass buckles and studs, and 2 white camellias in his ears. His mane was divided and curled, and each curl was tied with bows of colored ribbon. He had a girth of gold and silver round his body, and his tail was plaited with amaranth and blue velvet ribbons. He was, in fact, a little donkey to fall in love with. The director, in presenting him to the public, added these few words: My respectable auditors, I am not here to tell you the falsehoods of the great difficulties that I have overcome in understanding and subjugating this mammifer, whilst he was grazing at liberty amongst the mountains and the plains of the torrid zone. I beg you'll observe the wild rolling of his eyes. Every means have been tried in vain to tame him, and to accustom him to the life of domestic quadrupeds. I was often forced to have recourse to the convincing argument of the whip, but all my goodness to him, instead of gaining his affections, has, on the contrary, increased his viciousness. However, following the system of Gall, I discovered in his cranium a bony cartilage that the faculty of medicine in Paris is itself recognized as the regenerating bulb of the hair and of dance. For this reason, I have not only taught him to dance, but also to jump through hoops and through frames covered with paper. Admire him, and then pass your opinion on him. But before taking my leave of you, permit me, ladies and gentlemen, to invite you to the daily performance that will take place tomorrow evening. But in the apotheosis that the weather should threaten rain, the performance will be postponed till tomorrow morning at 11 antemeridian of postmeridian. Here the director made another profound bow, and then turning to Pinocchio, he said, "Courage, Pinocchio. Before you begin your feats, make your bow to this distinguished audience, ladies, gentlemen, and children." Pinocchio obeyed and bent both his knees till they touched the ground, and remained kneeling until the director, cracking his whip, shouted at him, "At a foot's pace!" Then the little donkey raised himself on his four legs and began to walk round the theater, keeping at a foot's pace. After a little, the director cried, "Trot!" and Pinocchio, obeying the order, changed to a trot. "Gallop!" and Pinocchio broke into a gallop. "Full gallop!" and Pinocchio went full gallop. But whilst he was going full speed like a racehorse, the director, raising his arm in the air, fired off a pistol. At the shot, the little donkey, pretending to be wounded, fell his whole length in the circus, as if he was really dying. As he got up from the ground amidst an outburst of applause, shouts, and clapping of hands, he naturally raised his head and looked up. And he saw in one of the boxes a beautiful lady who wore round her neck a thick gold chain from which hung a medallion. On the medallion was painted the portrait of a puppet. "That is my portrait. That lady is the fairy," said Pinocchio to himself, recognizing her immediately. And overcome with delight, he tried to cry, "Oh, my little fairy! Oh, my little fairy!" But instead of these words, a "bray" came from his throat, so sonorous and so prolonged that all the spectators laughed, and more especially all the children who were in the theater. Then the director, to give him a lesson and to make him understand that it is not good manners to step on a cat. It is not good manners to bray before the public, gave him a blow on his nose with the handle of his whip. The poor little donkey put his tongue out an inch and licked his nose for at least 5 minutes, thinking perhaps that it would ease the pain he felt. But what was his despair when, looking up a second time, he saw that the box was empty and that the fairy had disappeared. He thought he was going to die. His eyes filled with tears, and he began to weep. Nobody, however, noticed it, and least of all the director, who, cracking his whip, shouted, "Courage, Pinocchio! Now let the audience see how gracefully you can jump through the hoops." Pinocchio tried 2 or 3 times, but each time that he came in front of the hoop, instead of going through it, he found it easier to go under it. At last he made a leap and went through it, but his right leg, unfortunately, caught in the hoop, and that caused him to fall to the ground, doubled up in a heap on the other side. When he got up, he was lame, and it was only with great difficulty that he managed to return to the stable. "Bring out Pinocchio! We want the little donkey! Bring out the little donkey!" shouted all the boys in the theater, touched and sorry for the sad accident. But the little donkey was seen no more that evening. The following morning, the veterinary, that is, the doctor of animals, paid him a visit and declared that he would remain lame for life. The director then said to the stable boy, "What do you suppose I can do with a lame donkey? He would eat food without earning it. Take him to the market and sell him." When they reached the market, a purchaser was found at once. He asked the stable boy, "How much do you want for that lame donkey?" 20 francs. "I will give you 20 pence. Don't suppose that I am buying him to make use of. I am buying him solely for his skin. I see that his skin is very hard, and I intend to make a drum with it for the band of my village." I leave it to my listeners to imagine poor Pinocchio's feelings when he heard that he was destined to become a drum. As soon as the purchaser had paid his 20 pence, he conducted the little donkey to the seashore. He then put a stone round his neck, and tying a rope to the end of which he held in his hand round his leg, he gave him a sudden push and threw him into the water. Pinocchio, weighed down by the stone, went at once to the bottom, and his owner, keeping tight hold of the cord, sat down quietly on a piece of rock to wait until the little donkey was drowned, intending then to skin him. And that's it. There's like 2 chapters left, maybe 3. So that is the end of today's chapter. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Have a great day. Keep safe.
Yes, I'm having a reading lesson book. They know how to spell S-H.
Very good.
Bye.